I'm going to begin a series today through the book of 2 Timothy, teaching verse by verse through 2 Timothy. Before we begin doing that, today I want to talk about Paul, a little bit of background about his history, where he came from, and particularly where he is at while he's writing 2 Timothy. He is in Rome, in prison, not during the book of Acts, during his first imprisonment, where he was under house arrest in his own rented apartment with people coming and going, visiting for a couple of years. He is in the Mamertine prison, which is a cistern that was dug out in the 600 BC by the fourth Roman king. And it was used as a prison. It ended up having two levels. The bottom level was a dungeon, room about, it'd be 22 by 30 feet, had a 6.5 foot ceiling. And in this dungeon, at the end of the room, at the end of the 22 feet, was a grate that would open up, a metal grate that would open up into the sewer. And if someone would starve or die down there, they'd just push their body into the sewer and they would run out into the Tiber River. This is where Paul is at when he writes the book of 2 Timothy. Now remember, in his first imprisonment, in the book of Acts, recorded in the book of Acts, he was free to write, free to visit people. He had to stay in an apartment that was rented and would appear before Nero. So this in 2 Timothy is Paul's second time or second imprisonment to be appearing in front of Nero. Apparently, they knew each other from these encounters. History records through the traditions that Nero and Paul had become familiar with each other. Not necessarily friendly, but they knew each other by name, knew each other by appearance. And so Nero's going to recognize Paul the second time he's there for sure. So we'll talk about the details of that when we get into the book of 2 Timothy. But first, I want to talk about Paul's time, how he got to this position. And I'm going to use the framework book that I put together in 2008. I'm on page 237 looking at church history events. And this is just talking about Paul's general flow of events. In 35 AD, assuming Jesus was crucified in 30 AD, Paul had his road to Damascus experience in 35 AD, recorded in Acts chapter 9. And when he got to Damascus, he then is baptized and ends up going into Arabia for a period of 3 years. So 36, 37 AD, he's in Arabia alone, apparently reviewing, studying, having the Lord teach him. And by 38 AD, he's back in Damascus, where he begins to preach and teach in the synagogues. He's forced out of town because they threaten his life, and he flees to Jerusalem in 38 AD, where he's going to spend about 15 days just getting to know the Christians. He's going to meet with Peter. Barnabas is actually going to have to introduce him, because remember, before Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus in 35 AD, he spent several years killing, persecuting, hunting down, arresting, bringing before the Sanhedrin believers in Jesus Christ. Paul was doing what he thought was right, and that was stopping this new cult that followed this so-called Messiah, Jesus. Well, he meets this Messiah on the road to Damascus in 35 AD. So when he returns to Jerusalem in 38 AD, the Christians aren't very excited about meeting him because they really suspect that this may be some kind of a ploy. Barnabas breaks through that, and Paul begins to teach. He debates the Grecian Jews, the synagogue of the freemen, and has some dialogue with them, trying to explain his views of the scriptures to them. It ends up, he is threatened there in Jerusalem. His life is threatened. So he was threatened in Damascus. He's threatened in Jerusalem. So he flees and goes up to Tarshish in Cilicia, in his area where he's from. He's born in Tarshish, which makes him a Roman citizen, which is going to play out large in this story. Because to be executed as a Roman citizen, you have to be decapitated. You can't be crucified like a slave or a non-citizen. Peter, for example, was crucified apparently upside down because he was not a citizen of Rome, had no rights in that condition. In 39 AD, Paul is preaching in Cilicia and Syria, north of Antioch in the Galatian area. And by 42 AD, Barnabas goes up from Jerusalem and visits the church in Antioch, Syria, and decides they need a teacher like Paul, or still called Saul at this time. So he goes up into Cilicia and begins to look for Saul and finds him, brings him down. And Saul's going to then begin teaching for several years in the church of Antioch. During this time, the church is visited by some Jews from Jerusalem. And beginning in 46 AD, Paul is going to go on his first missionary journey. It's a short journey up through Galatia area, visiting several cities, starting several churches, always going to the synagogues first. And by 47 AD, 48 AD, they've returned to Antioch, and there they meet the church that Paul's been teaching in for a period of about 4 or 5 years, been teaching in Antioch. He finds the church having been infiltrated by Judaizers who are leading the Christians to follow the Jewish law. Paul argues with them, but that leads to the need for the Jerusalem Council in 48 AD, where the church has to decide what are they going to do about the Jewish law. Do the Gentiles who are coming to faith in Christ need to follow the Jewish law, or can they bypass the Jewish law and just come to faith in Christ and have a life of freedom in Christ, living by faith and observing the transformation that Christ brings in their life? This was the debate of 48 AD. It was resolved that they did not need to, but they had to be conscious of the Jewish culture, but there's no need for them to follow the Jewish law. This was established in 48 AD. So Paul is sent off to proclaim that message from the Jerusalem Council in the Galatian churches. And in 49 AD, he writes the book of Galatians, his first book, and goes on a missionary journey between 49 and 52 AD, going from Antioch, going all the way through Asia Minor, Phrygia, and up to Troas, which is on the coast. Ancient Troy is on the coast of the Aegean Sea, and from there he's called by God to go across the Aegean Sea and enter Europe. And he goes into Philippi and then down into Thessalonica, starts church in Philippi, Thessalonica, ends up in Athens alone because he'd been put in prison in Philippi, chased out of Thessalonica, chased out of Berea, ends up in Athens alone, and ends up talking to the philosophers on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. And there he converts a couple of them, and they listen to him seriously teach as a philosopher the Christian philosophy, including the resurrection from the dead. He leaves there and goes to Corinth alone, without a job, without money, has to get a job in Corinth, and through a series of events, he gets a job, starts a church when the synagogue divides, meets Aquila and Priscilla, and then coming down from Thessalonica up in Macedonia is Timothy and Silas. They come down and ask him some questions because the church of Thessalonica has some questions, and he writes to them 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He's there in Corinth from 51 to 52 AD, and that ends his second missionary journey when he leaves Corinth, stops by Ephesus, and sails to Jerusalem to greet the church in Jerusalem in 52 AD. From there he goes back up into Antioch, greets the church in Antioch. That's kind of his home base, his home church. And in 53 AD, he begins his third missionary journey, which is going to take him across the Galatian churches, across Asia, directly into Ephesus, which is on the coast of the Aegean Sea, south of Troas. And there he's going to spend 3 years in Ephesus. That is where he's going to write 1st and 2nd Corinthians. A lot more activities take place during that 3 years, including teaching daily in a lecture hall in Ephesus. But he has a little uprising, a little revolt in the a huge problem in the Corinthian church, and he deals with that during those 3 years. Eventually, after 3 years, he goes up into Macedonia and down into Corinth in 57 AD, where he meets the church again after having gone through a whole series of problems with them during that 3 years in Ephesus. And in Corinth, in 57 AD, he writes the letter to the Romans. Now, by this time, contrary to many people's understanding, the Church of Rome is already up and running. Paul has not been to Rome, but he's writing a letter to the Church of Rome. Peter has not been to Rome, but the Church of Rome is already up and running, probably being started from people that came back from the day of Pentecost and started the church, and people coming and going, traveling to and from Rome. So the Roman church is very solid at this time. You can read the letter of Romans. Paul is basically explaining to them his doctrine, his views, and this is important, asking them at the end of the letter, the main reason he'd like to come is for them to unite and then send him on a missionary journey from Rome into Spain. He wants to go to Spain with the message. His goal is not Rome. He wants to get to Rome so they can send him to his goal, which is in Spain. And that's going to be important for the story. Now, after he spent time there in Corinth in 57 AD, he writes the letter to the Romans telling them he plans to visit and hoping they can send him into Spain. He then sails back to Jerusalem, where he is arrested. He is arrested and spends 2 years in prison in Caesarea. All these things I've recorded in my teachings through the book of Acts. He's going to be in Jerusalem in 57 AD, and where he's arrested. He's going to be placed in prison on Fort Antonia for a few months. in Jerusalem, but then he realizes the seriousness of the trouble. He's going to be sent to Caesarea, where he's going to appear before the Felix and Festus, the governors, and in front of Herod Agrippa between the years 58, 59, and 60, where Paul is not getting out of prison because they just leave him there. It pleases the Jews. You can read all about this in the book of Acts and other places. And the Jews are bringing accusations against him. The leaders are hoping they're going to pay. Paul's going to offer some kind of bribe. But he realized that if he is released from Caesarea, the Jews will just execute him. They'll kill him. They'll hunt him down. So he appeals to Festus, to Felix, to the proconsul, to go to the emperor. He appeals to Caesar, and so he's going to be sent to Rome to appear before Caesar. This is still the book of Acts. And he arrives in Rome in 60 AD after having been shipwrecked for the winter in 60 AD, or 59, 60 AD that winter. He arrives in Rome and spends 2 years in Rome. This is his first time, 60, 61, 62 AD, under house arrest, his own rented apartment. Church members are coming and going. The Jews are coming and going, talking with him, and he's having basically daily Bible class in his rented apartment. He appears before Nero on a couple of occasions, but during this time he teaches the Roman Christians. He teaches apparently in the Praetorian Guard. Some of the guards become believers during this time. He makes testimony in front of Nero's court, who's ever there listening. He makes testimony on what his problem is and why he's being tried. And he writes letters like Colossians and Philemon and Ephesians, the prison epistles, and we've studied all those. Now, the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest, waiting to hear the decision. In the letter to the Philippians, he gives the impression he's going to be released. In the letter to Philemon, he tells Philemon to get a guest room ready because he will come visit after his release when he's done. And his release apparently is in 62 AD. Now the book of Acts comes to a close right there. So now I'm going to share a few things that we have some speculation. We've got some letters that are written after the book of Acts come to a close, after the prison epistles, namely 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. And these are going to be some guidelines in what is going on. But we do no longer have an historical account like Luke provides up until 62 AD. So the years between 62 AD and Paul's death, which again could be the spring of 68 AD or the fall of 67 AD. Some people push it all the way up to 64 AD during the early Roman persecutions under Nero. That's fine because we don't know for sure. But I'm going to give you a model that has Paul being released in 62 AD and then executed on the Via Ostia around 67 fall or 68 spring. Now before we leave this, I do want to point out some historical facts within the book of Acts. Again, I'm looking at the framework book on page 14 right now under the apologetics section on why we know the book of Acts is authentic. That it was closed in 62 AD by Luke and he didn't come back and make changes. Now this is internal evidence in the book of Acts. Because some major things are going to take place within a few weeks, months, and the next couple of years after the closing of the book of Acts that would be real nice to have added into the book of Acts. Or at least have Luke refer to them. Or if it's a pseudo-author, he definitely would have referred to them. But the very fact that these things are not in the book of Acts, they're not even anticipated in the book of Acts, gives the impression that the book of Acts is authentic, written by Luke and done by 62 AD with Paul still under house arrest during his first Roman imprisonment. And here are some of the things. First of all, some things that take place is in 64 AD, there's going to be a fire in Rome. Several of the sections of Rome, the quarters of Rome, were burnt and destroyed. No one knows how it happened. Tacitus, the Roman historian, says the public suspected it was Nero. Nero, wanting to rebuild things and do things his own way, just burned out some of the sections of Rome. Nero finds himself, even if it's true or not, does find himself, according to the Roman historian, under pressure from the public that he is the one who causes, so his poll numbers are going down. He has to find someone to blame. If he burnt it or if he didn't burn it, this is the fact. He found someone to blame, so the blame would be taken off of him. and he blamed the Christians. This was this new group that was arising. They're kind of they were not understood, but they're growing in popularity. It was kind of like a new religion, different than not the foreign gods, but the Greek gods and the Roman gods of the time. And so they weren't necessarily popular. So Nero's going to blame them and call them all kinds of names, all kinds of accusations, basically saying they started the fire. The public is going to buy into it. Great persecution is going to break out. Christians at this time are going to be fed to the animals in the Colosseum for entertainment. They're going to be lit up like torches for evening lighting during Nero's festivities. Just cruel, cruel persecutions. It is at this time in 64 AD, public tide turns against the Christians. Peter, who is in Rome at that time, is arrested and martyred in 64 AD. None of this is mentioned. Also, in 66 AD, just 4 years later, the Jewish wars break out. As the book of Acts closes, there's the Sanhedrin is still functioning in the book of Acts. Jerusalem and the Jews are free. Jews are traveling throughout Rome, visiting Paul, a Christian. So the Christians, the Jews, and the Romans in the book of Acts, at the end of the book of Acts, are all interacting peacefully together. By 64 AD, within 2 years, the Christians are being persecuted. By 66 AD, the Jewish wars have broken out, and the Romans and the Jews are at war. So not only are the Jews persecuting Christians, they're at war with the Jews. So all these details, you don't even see them arising in the book of Acts. And so there's no hint of, and Jerusalem then falls in 70 AD. And so there's no mention of the fall of Jerusalem. There's no mention of the burning of Rome. There's no deterioration of Jewish and Roman relations, including the Christians. There's no hint of James' martyrdom, which would have taken place in 63 AD. Within 12 months, less than 12 months of the book of Acts being closed, James, Jesus' brother, is pushed off the Temple Mount and then beaten to death as a martyr. It's not mentioned. That would have happened within a few months. So there's several things within there that don't mention some of the things that are coming up that are going to be important. So we think the book of Acts is authentic by faith, but also internal evidence gives the impression this is an authentic book that no one has messed with. Now, since archaeology and all these places that Paul traveled that were recorded by Luke, they've all been confirmed archaeologically. The travel routes, the culture, even the language has been confirmed. So the book of Acts is authentic, but the book of Acts ends around 62 AD. Now what takes place to set up the book of 2 Timothy is we've got to track Paul now from 62 AD to his death in 67 or 68 AD. We cannot do it by the authority of Scripture. We cannot do it by any kind of a detailed historical account, but there are definitely some clues that line up with the book of 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy that kind of give us a clue. The biggest clue is, I'm going to start with, is in Romans chapter 15, beginning in verse 22. And this is Paul writing to the Romans, where he's going to tell them his goal is to visit Rome, the Roman church that's up and established, so that they can send by 57 AD, well established by 62 AD, that they can then send him further west. He wants to go to the extreme west. He wants to get to Spain. Here it is, Romans chapter 15, verse 22. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, he's talking from Corinth, he's come all the way through Asia, Macedonia, Achaia, that's all covered. He's got churches in all those areas, all the way up to the coast of Rome. Since there's no longer place for me to work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. He is not coming to Rome to start the church. The church is already there. He is coming to Rome to pass through Rome to go to Spain. He's hoping the Roman church can help finance his adventures, his missionary work in Rome. I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while. Indeed, he wants to stop and visit, teach them, have them share with him. Now, he's never been to Rome yet. This is 57 AD. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. He's taken money down to the saints of Jerusalem who have had a famine, who are under persecution, cut off from their family inheritance, because the Jewish believers who accept Christ are cut off from their family inheritance because they're rejected, so they need some kind of financial help, and the Gentiles are bringing this financial help. Paul does not realize he's going to be arrested as soon as he arrives by the Jews on the Temple Mount. But anyway, he's going to do this as soon as he brings some aid to the Christians in Jerusalem. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. For they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in the spiritual blessings, they ought to also be of service to them in material blessings. When therefore I have completed this, that's the bringing of this money to Jerusalem, along with several other people that traveled with him, and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you, Rome. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessings of Christ. And that is his plan. Now that is his plan, to go to Jerusalem and then come back to Rome, or come to Rome for the first time, and have them help send him on his way. Now, what takes place, as we know in the book, in the rest of the book, he gets there to Jerusalem in 57, 58 AD. He's arrested on the Temple Mount, false charges, and ends up appealing to Caesar for his case with the Jews are bringing against him. The Jews never really bring any witnesses. And basically the case at the end of the book of Acts is dismissed, thrown out of court, and Paul is released. He's been now in Rome for 2 years, so the church has gotten to know him. He's ministered to the church. We assume, in fact, it says he lived in his own rented apartment, that the Roman church would have helped finance the rent needed for that rented apartment. Now, once he gets out of that prison, of that rented house arrest, he's going to go somewhere. Now, again, just to be fair, some people think he was executed at that time, and he'd already written 1st and 2nd Timothy, and that's fine if you want to develop your theory, your model that way. But this fits so much better, I think. It's not an attack on Scripture at all, because in this case, it closes down the recordings. We just got to historically put it together. It fits smoother if we do it this way. Especially look at the book of Acts. There's no one killing anybody as far as persecution. But by 64 AD, all hell is broken out against the church in Rome, and it's spreading. Plus the Jewish wars break out in 66 AD. Now, what we have then is the idea that Paul could have gone to... I've got right here a coin. This is a coin of Nero from the same time period. It's a silver coin. It's an authentic coin. It's got an image of Nero himself with the Egyptian headdress and an Egyptian of deity, a headdress of deity on this side. It's a coin that would have been in circulation during this very time period. And I just wanted to kind of point that out. It's kind of nice to have things like that. But nonetheless, when Paul is released by Nero, the guy right there on that coin, releases him in 62 AD, Paul would have resumed his ministry. He's not going to retire. And if we follow his anticipation, his desires, his goal, he would have gone further west into Spain for a couple of years. And then he would have returned to the Mediterranean world, traveled through those churches that he'd already started, including Corinth and Ephesus. We know Titus is sent to Crete, so Paul's on the island of Crete, visiting the early church there, drops Titus off there, and travels through. He's eventually going to be arrested. Now, where Paul is arrested at after coming back from Spain, we do not know. Some think Paul went back into Rome, and then, of course, would have been immediately arrested. That's possible. He may have been arrested anytime he got back into the Mediterranean world, because they may be looking for him, because they know he's a leader. Peter's already been executed. They know Paul's a leader. Nero knows of Paul. He's already met Paul. And he may have been, in a sense, hunted. He talks in the book of 2 Timothy that we'll see that he leaves his coat and his parchments and his papyrus in the city of Troas, ancient Troy, where he'd first left Asia and gone into Philippi during his second missionary journey, at someone's house, and asked Timothy to come visit him in Rome and bring with him his coat, his parchments, and his papyrus. Now, the parchment would have been animal skin books. That would have been like the Old Testament or some, study books that maybe would have been purchased or hand copied on animal skin. They were actual books. The papyrus most likely would be letters or notes. This is the paper of the day. So the difference would be books and notes. Parchment and notes. And the notes could have included letters Paul had sent, maybe a library of the letters he'd sent, copies. He had people writing for him. Paul could write, of course, he's a trained Pharisee, but he had people doing writing for him. We can look at this at different places. Nonetheless, he gets arrested, maybe in Troas, that's why he left those things there, maybe in Ephesus, maybe coming through Macedonia, maybe he went to Rome. We do not know where he's arrested, but we do know that he ends up back in Rome sometime in 66 AD. Now again, if he leaves prison in 62 AD, goes to Spain and comes back, we're going to put at least 2 years in there, 62, 63, 64 AD. That's the burning, Rome is burned. That's when Peter's executed. He's going to come back in 65 AD, 66 AD. He's going to have some time to travel because he's going to have, Timothy's going to be in Ephesus. He's going to have Titus in Crete. Several other people. There's going to be many names mentioned in the book of 2 Timothy of where he's left people. Some people have actually left Paul because the persecution is severe. He's going to have people actually abandoning him. In fact, what you see in the book of Acts, where the church came and visited Paul in the book of Acts in 62 AD, 60 to 62 AD, while he's under house arrest, during this time in the Mamertine prison, and during his court case, he says everyone is deserted. He says no one came to my defense. In other words, it would be foolish to come to Paul's defense at this time or even come visit him because they're killing Christians. In 62 AD, they're not killing Christians. 65, beginning in 64, but 65, 66, 67, merely visiting Paul is a risk for your life. And so things are different, or different climate. And he is in the Mamertine prison sometime after his arrest in 66, 60, 65, 66 AD, maybe 67. But you've got to give him some time to travel the Mediterranean world. He even tells Titus where he's planning on wintering. He's planning on wintering on the west coast of Macedonia, of Achaia, in a Mediterranean resort town, for the winter. Paul's, 66 some years old, and he's going to spend the winter in this city on the coast. And he mentions that in the book of Titus. But nonetheless, by this time, he's arrested and is put in this prison. It's 22 by 30 feet. He's going to be brought out for trial. And in the book of 2 Timothy, he's going to have been brought out for trial and presented his case and then sent back to the Mamertine prison to wait for the decision. And so he's going to be, sitting here in this cell writing Timothy a letter. Most likely, 2 Timothy is written in 67 AD, early in 67. And Paul tells Timothy in the letter to please come before winter. We're assuming that is the winter of 67. Paul may have been dead by the time Timothy got there. Timothy may never have made it. Or Timothy may have come and visited him and got out of town. But Paul then would be executed in the fall of 67. Or if Timothy came and spent time with him, Paul would have been executed in 68 in the spring. But concerning this trip to Spain, I'm not alone just in Romans talking about this trip to Spain. This is one of the things I want to point out, is we've got some early church witnesses that indicate that Paul did make it to Spain. And I'm looking right now, Clement of Rome, which would be one of the pastors or the bishop of Rome. He is a bishop in 96 AD. The Apostle John is still alive in Ephesus in 96 AD. Actually, he'd be on the Isle of Patmos during this time, but he'd return in 98 AD to the mainland after the execution of Domitian and when Trajan became the ruler. But anyway, 96 AD, the Apostle John is still alive. And Clement writes to the Corinthian church. Clement, now this is not a Bible verse, this is just an early writing of the church leader of Rome, Clement, writing to the church of Corinth, which still is having trouble in 96 AD. And Clement is going to write these words to them, encouraging them to be persistent. He's going to be using the term, the metaphor of an athlete, of trying to be strong, compete, and finish the race as an athlete. He writes to the Corinthians in 96 AD, let us come to those who were athletes in the days nearest our own. He'd already gone through some Old Testament references, and now he comes and says, let us consider those nearest our day, meaning the days of the apostles, who were athletes who competed in the faith in days near ours. In fact, some of these people would know Paul and Peter. In fact, they know John. John's alive. And Clement would have known, most likely as a younger man, may have known Paul. He says, they maintained their athletic contest unto death. Let us set before our eyes the good apostles, Peter and Paul, on account of jealousy and strife, showed the way to the prize of endurance. In other words, they suffered martyrdom due to jealousy and strife. Then he goes on and describes Paul as saying, 7 times he wore fetters, he was exiled, he was stoned, he was a herald both in the east and the west. East, Asia; west, Rome and Spain, assuming Spain. He gained the noble renown of his faith. He taught righteousness throughout the whole world. Now watch this. Here's the part we're looking for. And having reached the limit of the west. Hear the word limit. It is the word terma. Limit. The terma, limit of the west. Terma can also be translated goal of the west. So terma is the word. It means goal or it means limit. That Paul, having reached the terma, the limit or the goal of the west, he bore testimony before the rulers, and so departed from the world and was taken up into the holy place, the greatest example of endurance. So here we've got Clement saying, writing from Rome, saying Paul reached the limit of the west, or the goal of the west. So in context here, since he's writing about athletes, limit is a good translation, but goal would be even a better translation, that Paul reached his goal. And then we read Romans like we just did. Paul says, I want to visit Rome because my goal is to get to Spain. It all ties together, that Paul reached his goal or reached the limit of the West. Now, some would say, well, that's Rome. That could be. But it's hard to imagine it's Rome, since Clement is writing from Rome and Paul had already reached Rome. So if you're writing in Rome saying the limit is Rome, the West, especially when Spain's out there yet to reach. And so I'm going to use that as an example of Paul having reached the limits. Now, one of the places there that would be suggested would be Cadiz. It's on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar. It's right there, on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, so it's facing the Atlantic Ocean. That would be the limit. So Paul, if he spent a couple years traveling in Spain, we don't know anything about this. It's going to be recorded in other places that he reached Spain. But he may have actually gone past the Strait of Gibraltar on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean and even looked into the Atlantic Ocean. Again, we're speculating, but this is important, just kind of get a perspective. Several early church fathers mentioned that he made this reach. Origen, writing in 220 AD, in his 3rd volume on his commentary on Genesis, says that Paul reached Spain. Watch this. The Muratorian canon, which is from 170 AD, it's a fragment in Latin, and it's the earliest list of New Testament books, meaning this is the listing the new books that are accepted as the books for the New Testament from 170. It says this in there. It says, then the Acts of the Apostles were written in one book. That's what we just referred to. Luke tells the most excellent Theophilus. That's what the book of Acts is addressed to, Theophilus, same way as the book of Luke is. That the various incidents took place in his presence, and indeed he makes this quite clear by omitting, now watch this, what they're writing here in this fragment from 170 AD that we can read, it still exists, that the book of Acts was the things that Luke witnessed. So all those things that he writes down are things, and you can see him using references like they went, and then he starts using terms like, or the pronoun we, or us. And you can see this within the book when Luke is there witnessing. But he says here in this Muratorian canon, this fragment written in Latin in 170 AD, that he records the incidences that took place in his presence, and indeed he makes this quite clear by omitting the passion of Peter, as well as Paul's journey when he set out from Rome to Spain. So in other words, he says, Luke does not write about Peter's death because Luke did not see it. Plus, again, it was closed by 62 AD. And we know that was historical, that Peter did die. And he says, as well as Paul's journey when he set out from Rome to Spain. So he does not record that. historical event of going to Spain. So that is 170 AD. So there we've got three so far. We've got Clement, 96 AD. We've got the Muratorian Canon, 170 AD. 220 Origen. Eusebius confirms that in 325. Then we've got this book from 180 AD, which again, we don't want to put too much credit in this because it's a Gnostic work. It's called the Acts of Peter. It's a fragment. The best fragment is the Vercelli fragment. It's in Latin. And it begins by describing Paul's departure from Italy by sea for Spain. So again, this is not a book written by the Orthodox Christians, but it's still a book written by Gnostics speaking of this as a historical event. Jerome talks about it in 400 AD that Paul indeed went to Spain. So we're going to assume this is true, at least, consider that Paul went to Spain. I've got in the framework book on page 245 a little map showing where that would have gone and some details about this. And we'll get into more of the details that are in the book of 2 Timothy. But again, the idea here is the book of Acts closes in 62 AD with Paul having written Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians and Philemon, the prison epistles, and then being set free by Nero, who knows Paul by face, and probably, no doubt, Paul testified to Nero because we've got a record in the book of Acts of Paul's testimony to Felix and Festus and Herod Agrippa. And so he would have testified to his faith to Nero. So Nero has heard the gospel from the Apostle Paul. Paul is then set free, and from being set free, we do not know where he goes. But we do know he writes 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy, that he's going to end up being in Ephesus with Timothy again. He's going to end up being in Crete with Titus again. He's going to leave some other people different places, recorded, as he mentions, in the book of 2 Timothy. But that could have taken place in 66, 67 AD before he's arrested. Maybe 65, 67 AD before he's arrested. Now, between 62 and 65 AD, we're going to take Paul and assume he goes to Spain, as we saw in these ancient witnesses, and then he's going to come back, move through the Mediterranean world, and then is arrested. When he's arrested, he's going to be taken to the Mamertine prison, where he's going to be kept, be brought before Nero. Now, the Mamertine prison is not a prison like we have today, where people are kept in prison and penalized with time in prison. The Mamertine prison was not a place where prisoners were kept for penalty. They were kept for their trial, returned, and then when the decision was made, what was going to be happened to them, the verdict, if they were going to be set free or if they were going to be executed, they would be taken out of the Mamertine prison and then taken to the place of execution. Paul is in the Mamertine prison, not doing time, but waiting for his case to be heard the first time, and then waiting for his appearance the second time to hear the verdict. In 2 Timothy, he says things like, I know my time is near, I'm being poured out like a drink offering, I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith, now's the crown of righteousness is in store for me. I mean, he's clear that he knows he's not going to get out, because Peter's already been crucified by Nero in 64 AD. Christians are being burnt at the stake. They're being killed in the Colosseum. Nero's not going to look at Paul and say, well, I'll give you a pass this time. Paul knows his days are numbered, or his hours are numbered. So he's going to be going to his execution. Other things that could take place is people could be taken, once they're tried, they could be taken and sentenced to hard labor in the mills or the mines or the quarries, or they could be put into exile. But they were never put in a Mamertine prison or any prison just to serve time. Now later on in the empire, they're going to start doing prison time, but this is not the case for Paul. Paul is here waiting to hear his case. So when he's writing 2 Timothy, he's waiting until Nero has a chance to make a verdict on the case that he has heard. So now, some morning, probably in 67 AD, and you can choose 62 AD if you want to. You can choose 64 AD, 67, 68. I'm going to put this right around 67 AD. Maybe this, I'm not even going to give a definite time. Fall of 67, spring of 68. Tradition gives the date of June in the spring of 68. Paul is going to be taken out of the Mamertine prison and led about 5 miles out of town down the Austrian way to a place where he'll be executed. The executioner, they would have taken the walk. He would have gone out maybe with other prisoners, but Paul's case is now decided. He's going to be beheaded. He's not going to be crucified upside down. He's not going to be, in a sense, tortured. He's going to be decapitated. He would have been taken out. The traditional site that they've got, which I'm going to show you was marked very, very early, is a place by there's three springs there. The three springs are called the Aqua Salvia, which means the healing waters. There's still three springs today. There's three springs there in Paul's day. It's about 5 miles out of town by the third mile marker from the city of Rome on the Austrian Way, which is about a 19-mile road that goes into Austria, which is the coast, the west coast, the port on the west of Rome. There you would be by a pine tree on the Austrian Way outside the city. Now, they're not going to execute these people in the city of Rome. They're going to take them outside to have them decapitated. Just like crucifixion takes place outside the city, Paul's execution takes place. We know this location potentially. There's a church there today, but it goes way back early times where this is marked. It's by the third milestone at this place of the springs, the healing waters. It's called the Three Fountains today. I'm reading from a guy who wrote, Gaius is his name, writing in 180 AD. He's writing to a guy named Proclus in Asia, who was in the Montanist group, which was an early charismatic breakout group, a lot of spiritual revelations and things. They became heretics. It's the Phrygian area of Asia. And he's bragging, Proclus is bragging because he's got the tomb of Philip and Philip's daughters there in his area. And so they should be taken serious. Well, Gaius is going to say this. He's going to write back. It says many things contradicting the false teaching of the Montanists in Phrygia. I mean, they got way off base, including the second coming. They thought Jesus was going to come back in their city there in Asia Minor. A whole bunch of things. They're living in the end times. But nonetheless, Gaius writes, I can point out the trophies of the apostles. For if you will go to the Vatican Hill, that's where Peter is, his death, or the Austrian Way, Via Ostia, you will find the trophies of those who founded this church. Now, church history, church tradition is going to, and in Rome, the church is going to claim Peter and Paul as the founders of the Church of Rome. This is not true. We know this is not true because the church was up and running before either one of them got there. Indeed, Peter visited Rome. Peter contributed to the Church of Rome. Paul definitely visited Rome, contributed to the Church of Rome, but they were not the founders. The church likes to build on that because it gives Rome more prominence. But Rome was started by people most likely coming out of the day of Pentecost from Jerusalem, returning back to their synagogues with the message of what they saw take place in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost in 30 AD. But nonetheless, he's saying that these guys founded the church and we've got their trophies. Now, the word trophies here is the word memoria, M-E-M-O-R-I-A-E, and it means monuments. We have their monuments marking the site of their martyrdom or the site of their burial. So in 180 A.D., Gaius, one of the pastors in Rome, is saying we've got their markers of where they were executed and where they were buried here in our city. Calls them the trophies. Now, at this place, the third milestone on the Austrian Way, they did find excavate this location, and they found where this church was built, where Paul was executed, an early church, and then built again by Constantine. They excavated there, doing some work for a sewer work there. They found coins from the time of Nero, and they found petrified pine cones, which is important because in the accounts, Paul was executed by a pine tree on the Austrian Way at that third mile marker. Now, as the story goes, what ends up taking place is some Christians would have accompanied Paul. Again, we talked about them being under the risk of persecution, of death themselves. But we do know that someone, while Paul is in the Mamertine prison, according to 2 Timothy, someone found Paul there. We're going to talk about that in 2 Timothy. And Paul's asking Timothy to come visit him. In fact, bring him some books and some parchments and some papyrus and his coat for the winter. So apparently there is some kind of freedom of visitation taking place. So to think that there's Christians that will accompany Paul to his execution is somewhat, especially if they're Roman citizens of good standing of the upper class, that is understandable. But here it is. After he was beheaded, he was taken back about a mile and a half to 2 miles back to what is called the 2nd mile marker into this area that was owned by Matrona Lucilia. This area is a vineyard during the days of Constantine, but in her day, it was a plot that she had, that she owned. She would be an elitist, an upper class Roman, and a believer. And she is going to place Paul's body in a sarcophagus or in a tomb. It was an above ground tomb, not in ground tomb, at that time after his decapitation, and it was a pagan cemetery. There was Romans buried at this area. Upper class Romans would have been buried here. She's going to put Paul here. It is going to be marked with a monument, and it's going to be recognized throughout the centuries as the place of Paul's burial. There's a church there today called St. Paul's Basilica outside the walls. So there's a church of St. Paul's at his place of execution. There's a place of a church at the place of his burial. Now, the history on this burial place begins like this. I've got some notes here, and first in 95 AD, we talked about the monuments being placed there, that they recognize it. In 200 AD, it's recognized, and then 320 AD, Constantine, who's now the first Christian empire, is going to go around and find all these locations. He's going to build a basilica over the place of this tomb of Paul's, this sarcophagus that was put there by Lucilla. And then Eusebius is going to make reference to this in 325. 390, the Emperor Theodosius is going to build a larger basilica on top of that. And that is going to endure up until 433, when part of the building is going to collapse because of an earthquake. During the renovations, they're going to take the sarcophagus and they're going to build the floor up around it. So now the sarcophagus is encased in the floor of the new basilica, or the remodeled basilica. And that's going to stand there until a fire breaks out in 1867. Or 1823, a fire is going to break out there, and someone's doing some repair work on the roof, and a fire breaks out and burns the whole thing down, basically. And it's going to be restored between the years of 1823 and 1875. They found the sarcophagus, and what they found also this time in 1867, they found 2 stone slabs that are going to have the words Paulo Apostolo Mart on it. And that's Latin for Paul, Apostle, and Martyr. And it's written in Latin, so I can show you a picture of it. They've got this right here. And these were slabs that were laid down. Maybe at one time they thought they stood up and formed. They had 4 sides to them, forming like a square monument going around, like this going around. And would have said, you'd been able to read it, Paul, Martyr, and Apostle. Apostle and Martyr would have gone around a little gravestone. They've now been, with only 2 of them remaining, they've been laid down there. They're still there today. You can see them. And the sarcophagus of Paul is there, covered up now with glass. Because here's what takes place just recently. I'm going to wrap this up. In 2002, work began to excavate to make the sarcophagus visible, because people would visit, and the sarcophagus was covered up. So what they did, they put a glass around it. The window's 28 inches by 39-inch window glass. You can see down into where the sarcophagus, where Paul was buried. And there's an altar there. There's a hole in the cover of the sarcophagus about 4 inches wide, that when people would drop down stuff, about 4 inches wide, they drop stuff into there on a string and let it touch the bones. Again, this is the way they used to do it, the early Christians. I consider it strange. I consider it superstitious. But nonetheless, they recognized this is what they did. And they'd reach down, touch things to the body, and bring it out. They'd have a relic and touch the bones of Paul. And so they can see these things. And when they would look in there, they eventually found there was some fabric that was found in there. In fact, in 2006, National Geographic actually is involved in this. St. Paul's stone coffin has been found beneath this basilica. Its contents remain a mystery. For now, in 2002, it says, "For now, we didn't open the sarcophagus to study the contents. Our aim was to unearth the coffin that was thought to be Paul's tomb, and so they could see it, not to authenticate it." The sarcophagus was buried beneath, and when they did this is when they found the two inscriptions. It says Paul, a martyr and apostle. Now in 2009, a mere 11 years ago, this white sarcophagus was opened, and the bones were tested that were in there, that had been in there since the first century. The bones were tested, revealing that they were from the 1st or 2nd century. Also found within the sarcophagus with the bones that were Paul's were, besides the bone fragments. Again, we're talking bone fragments, not like the skeleton, the fragments of bones that are 2,000 years old in the sarcophagus. They found grains of incense, because people used to drop incense as offerings down in there. Some coins were found. Some purple linen were found, and some blue fabric with linen filaments were found within the things people would drop down in there. In fact, there was you can see on the stones that in the picture, there's a hole where they put like a tube where they could pour, incense or offerings or ointments down into there as an offering and for prayer. Again, not something I'm real big into myself. In fact, I'm not interested in it at all. But the church throughout history has been doing that. So nonetheless, that is a little bit about where Paul has been buried. We can see the site of his imprisonment, the Mamertine prison, where he had been brought out for his first appearance and then sent back, waiting for Timothy, and then brought out and led down the Austrian way, via Ostia, down 5 miles outside the city, where he was executed. His head would have been laid down on a block, and his head was cut off with an axe, a hatchet, a military hatchet. His body was then collected by Christians, brought back towards the city, about 1.5 miles, maybe 2 miles, and then placed in Lucilla's sarcophagus tomb, and a monument would have been set up. This monument would have been set up and recognized for the next decades, and as the decades proceeded, the monument began to be replaced until finally now they've excavated and they've found the bones in this sarcophagus, in this tomb, to be a 1st century individual that was honored throughout the years with offerings and seeking it as a relic. So we have here, again, Paul's location of his burial, location of his execution, the location of his 2nd imprisonment. Now, the things I've shared with you are, I don't want to say speculation, because they're based on some historical information, but they're not by any means scriptural. They're by no means authoritative. What we have as authoritative is, in my view as a Christian, is the book of 2 Timothy. And in the book of 2 Timothy, Paul is not under house arrest like he was in the book of Acts. He's under arrest. He's in a place of suffering. He's begging Timothy to bring him a coat. I mean, if you need a coat, man, ask someone in town. I mean, they're coming and going in the book of Acts, visiting him every day. In Timothy, or in book 2 Timothy, he's going to ask Timothy to come from Ephesus to bring him a coat and his books and his parchments. The man is days away, months away from his execution. And now we're going to begin next time looking at the words that Paul writes in this condition to Timothy. Now, what I've shared with you is just some circulation of interesting information of Paul going to Spain, coming back, going to Crete, going to Ephesus, going through the Mediterranean world, traveling fairly quickly, including Nicopolis, the place he spent the winter, possibly in 66 AD. Probably going to Corinth again, visiting all the churches. Probably he told Philemon he was going to come see him, so he went to Colossae and visited Philemon, spent time with him in the guest room that Philemon had prepared for him, as Philemon had told him. But now, somewhere along the route, between coming back from Spain, 65, 66 AD, and being arrested 66, 67 AD. I think probably 67 AD he was arrested. He's now in the Mamertine prison, center of Rome, appearing before Nero, who knows Paul and is now hearing the gospel message for the second time. Rome has been burnt. The Christians have been blamed. Christians have been thrown into the Colosseum. Christians have been burnt at the stake. Peter's been executed, crucified upside down with his wife. And Nero's not going to let Paul go this time. And this is the case where Paul's going to begin to write the book of 2 Timothy. These are Paul's final words, and we'll begin that next time.